You know what I witnessed this week? And you're not going to believe this, but I watched the Trump administration essentially declare maritime warfare on Venezuela while simultaneously defending what critics are calling war crimes in the Caribbean. I'm talking to you right now because you deserve to understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, beyond the political theater, beyond the carefully crafted press releases that make none of this sound as serious as it actually is. So if you're here with me, if you're someone who wants the unfiltered truth about where this country is heading, hit that subscribe button. Not because I need the numbers, but because what we're discussing here matters. It matters for democracy, it matters for international law, and it matters for understanding how power actually works in this administration. This isn't entertainment. This is about understanding the decisions being made in your name. Here's what happened that should have everyone paying attention, regardless of your political affiliation. On Wednesday, December 10th, the Trump administration seized a Venezuelan oil tanker called the Skipper in what they're calling a law enforcement operation, but what Venezuela is calling an act of international piracy. We're talking about armed Coast Guard personnel rappelling from helicopters onto a vessel in international waters, taking control of a ship carrying nearly 2 million barrels of oil worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Trump announced it casually during a White House roundtable, saying they seized the largest tanker ever. And when asked what would happen to the oil, he said, quote, "We keep it, I guess." Think about that response for a moment. The President of the United States just authorized what amounts to the seizure of a foreign vessel and its cargo worth potentially $500 million. And his response about keeping it is, "I guess." Now, this seizure is happening at the exact same time that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is facing bipartisan congressional pressure over what's being called a double-tap strike that killed 2 survivors of a boat bombing in the Caribbean. We're talking about a situation where, according to multiple reports, the military hit a suspected drug vessel, saw that 2 people survived and were clinging to wreckage, and then ordered a second strike to kill those survivors. Military officials are calling it following orders. Critics are calling it a potential war crime. Both situations involve the same administration, the same approach to dealing with Venezuela, and the same questions about whether there are any limits on American military power when the target is labeled as a threat to national security. Before we go any further, I need to be absolutely clear about something here. I'm not telling you what to think about these operations. I'm not diagnosing anyone's mental state or making claims about classified information I don't have access to. What I'm doing is looking at what's been reported by major news organizations, what's been said by administration officials, and what's been documented in congressional hearings. This is about publicly available information and the questions that information raises about accountability and the rule of law. You can form your own opinions about whether these actions are justified or legal. My job is to make sure you understand what's actually happening. So let's break down what we know about this tanker seizure, because the details matter and they tell us something important about how this administration operates. The vessel called the Skipper was previously sanctioned in 2022 for allegedly facilitating oil trades for Hezbollah and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was sailing under a Guyanese flag, but had just loaded oil from a Venezuelan terminal and was reportedly headed toward Cuba. Attorney General Pam Bondi posted video of the operation showing heavily armed personnel boarding the vessel from helicopters, and she justified it by saying the tanker had been involved in an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations. According to multiple sources familiar with the operation, the seizure involved 2 helicopters, 10 Coast Guard members, 10 Marines, and Special Operations Forces. The helicopters launched from the USS Gerald Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet, which has been stationed in the Caribbean as part of what the administration calls its pressure campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The operation started around 6 a.m. and proceeded without casualties or resistance from the tanker's crew. The ship is now being taken to Galveston, Texas, where the crew will reportedly be released, but the oil will be held pending what the administration calls a legal process. Here's what makes this seizure particularly significant. Using military force to commandeer a merchant vessel in international waters is extraordinarily unusual in peacetime. Naval historians are calling it provocative and very unusual. One expert told NPR that such actions will likely deter maritime traffic from Venezuelan waters, saying if you have no maritime access, then you have no economy. Venezuela's government has denounced the seizure as blatant theft and international piracy, arguing that it reveals the true motivation behind U.S. pressure on their country, saying it's always been about our natural resources, our oil, our energy. But here's where this story gets really interesting, and this is what you need to understand about the broader context. This tanker seizure isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of an escalating military campaign in the Caribbean that has already killed at least 87 people in strikes on alleged drug smuggling vessels. The administration has moved more than 15,000 troops and a dozen warships, including an aircraft carrier strike group, into the region. They've conducted at least 22 strikes against suspected drug boats, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has been describing drug traffickers as narco-terrorists and comparing these operations to counterterrorism campaigns against al-Qaeda. The problem is that the administration has provided virtually no public evidence that the vessels they're attacking actually contain drugs. When lawmakers have pressed for transparency, they've been told the evidence is classified. When they've asked to see video footage of the strikes, the Pentagon has resisted. And when reports emerged that military officials killed survivors of a boat strike in September, the administration's response has been to double down and defend the operation rather than investigate whether rules of engagement were followed. This brings us to the Pete Hegseth controversy, which is directly connected to this broader militarization of anti-drug operations. According to reporting from the Washington Post, on September 2nd, U.S. forces struck a suspected drug vessel in the Caribbean, killing 9 of the 11 people on board. But 2 survivors were seen clinging to the wreckage, and Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley, who leads U.S. Special Operations Command, ordered a second strike to kill those survivors. Multiple sources told the Post that Hegseth had given a directive to kill everybody on drug boats, and Bradley was following that guidance when he ordered the follow-up attack. Hegseth has denied giving such an order, calling the reports fake news and fabricated. But when he appeared at the Reagan National Defense Forum on December 6th, he said he fully supports that strike and that he would have made the same call if he had been in the commander's position. Days later, when a conservative activist on social media said he wanted more drug boats blown up, Hegseth responded, "Your wish is my command, Andrew. Just sunk another narco boat." This isn't exactly the response you'd expect from someone who's concerned about potential war crime allegations. Last Thursday, Admiral Bradley briefed members of Congress on the September 2nd strike, and lawmakers emerged with completely different accounts of what they saw. Democrats said they were deeply disturbed by the footage and accused the Pentagon of potential war crimes. Republicans defended the operation and said they saw no evidence of wrongdoing. But here's what's particularly troubling about the briefing. According to multiple reports, Bradley told lawmakers that the boat wasn't actually heading to the United States at all. It was heading to Suriname, where its cargo would be transferred to larger vessels for transport to Europe. This undermines the administration's entire justification for the strike, which was that they were stopping drugs from reaching American communities. Think about what this means for a moment. The administration has been justifying these strikes by saying they're protecting Americans from drugs that would otherwise reach U.S. streets. But their own military commander told Congress that the boat they attacked wasn't coming to America. It was part of a trafficking route that leads to Europe. So why exactly were American forces authorized to kill 11 people on a boat that wasn't threatening American communities? And why was a second strike authorized to kill survivors who, according to some interpretations of the video, may have been trying to surrender? These questions matter because they go to the heart of what kind of military operations this administration thinks it can authorize and under what legal framework. The administration argues that all these strikes are legal because Trump designated various drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. But legal experts say this justification is unprecedented and that the U.S. doesn't have the authority to kill suspected drug traffickers in international waters just because they've been labeled as terrorists. International law is clear that killing shipwreck survivors, unless they pose an imminent armed threat, is prohibited. And there's been no indication that 2 people clinging to wreckage posed any kind of military threat to American forces. Senator Jim Himes, a Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, has been one of the most vocal critics of these operations. After seeing the classified footage, he said there's a certain amount of sympathy out there for going after drug runners, but I think it's really important that people see what it looks like when the full force of the United States military is turned on two guys who are clinging to a piece of wood. He's calling for the video to be declassified so the public can see what's being done in their name. Even some Republicans, like Senator Tom Cotton, have said they wouldn't object to releasing the footage, though they continue to defend the operation itself. What's really concerning here is the pattern of escalation and the apparent lack of oversight. The administration started with strikes on boats, moved to seizing tankers, and is now talking openly about potential ground operations in Venezuela. Trump told Politico this week that Maduro's days are numbered and refused to rule out a ground invasion. He's moved naval forces to the region that give him the capability to conduct airstrikes or amphibious operations if he chooses to do so. And throughout all of this, Congress has been largely shut out of the decision-making process, told that operational details are classified and that oversight would compromise ongoing operations. This is where the tanker seizure and the boat strike controversy connect to larger questions about executive power and democratic accountability. We're watching an administration that believes it can use military force against suspected criminals in international waters, seize foreign vessels and their cargo, and justify it all under the umbrella of counterterrorism operations. They're doing this without meaningful congressional oversight, without transparency about evidence or legal justifications, and without apparent concern for international law or diplomatic consequences. Venezuela has said they'll appeal the tanker seizure to international bodies and have denounced it as piracy. Cuban officials have called it an aggressive escalation. Even some U.S. allies are reportedly concerned about the precedent this sets for maritime law and the use of force against civilian vessels. If any other country seized American merchant ships in international waters and said they were keeping the cargo, the U.S. would rightfully call it piracy. But when America does it, the administration says it's law enforcement. Here's what I think is really happening here and why both of these stories matter for understanding how this administration operates. Trump and his team believe that when they label something as a national security threat, normal rules don't apply. They can use military force against suspected criminals. They can seize foreign property. They can kill people in international waters. And they can do it all without the kind of oversight or transparency that democracy requires. They're essentially arguing that the war on drugs justifies wartime powers, even though Congress has never declared war on Venezuela or authorized military operations against drug traffickers. This approach relies on the public accepting that threats are so severe and so immediate that there's no time for normal legal processes. It requires people to trust that the administration is only targeting legitimate threats and following appropriate rules of engagement. But when the administration refuses to share evidence, won't release video footage, and attacks critics who ask for transparency, that trust becomes very difficult to maintain. And when their own military commanders reveal that their stated justifications don't match the reality of what they're doing, it raises serious questions about whether this is really about protecting Americans or about something else entirely. If current trends continue, we're likely looking at further escalation in the Caribbean over the coming months. The administration has made it clear that they view military pressure on Venezuela as effective and justified. They've built up the forces necessary to conduct larger operations if they choose to do so, and they've established legal and political precedents that could justify even more aggressive action. Trump has repeatedly hinted at possible ground operations, and he's put military assets in place that would make such operations feasible. At the same time, congressional pressure over the boat strikes is likely to intensify, especially if more evidence emerges about what happened during the September 2nd operation. Democrats are demanding transparency and accountability, while Republicans are largely defending the administration but may become more critical if additional problematic details come to light. The question is whether Congress will use its oversight powers effectively or whether the administration will continue to claim that operational security prevents real accountability. What we're really seeing here is a test of whether democratic institutions can effectively check executive power when that power is exercised under the banner of national security. The administration is betting that public support for fighting drugs and opposing hostile regimes like Venezuela's will outweigh concerns about legal niceties or international law. They're calculating that as long as they can frame their actions as protecting Americans from threats, most people won't ask too many questions about methods or evidence. But democracy depends on the idea that government power has limits and that those limits are enforced by institutions designed to provide checks and balances. When an administration claims the authority to use military force against suspected criminals, seize foreign property, and operate without meaningful oversight, those limits are being tested. The Venezuela tanker seizure and the Caribbean boat strikes aren't just about drug policy or foreign relations. They're about what kind of powers we're willing to let our government exercise and under what circumstances. I can't tell you definitively whether these operations are legal under international law or whether they're effective at stopping drug trafficking. What I can tell you is that they represent a significant expansion of how the U.S. military is being used and that they're happening with minimal transparency or congressional oversight. The administration wants you to trust that they're only targeting legitimate threats and following appropriate rules. But trust without verification isn't accountability, and accountability is what distinguishes democratic governance from authoritarian rule. Here's what you can do about this situation. First, stay informed about what's actually happening, not just what political spin says is happening. Read multiple sources, look for primary documents when they're available, and pay attention to what critics from both parties are saying. Second, contact your representatives in Congress and ask them what they know about these operations and what oversight they're providing. Members of Congress from both parties have access to classified briefings, and they can ask harder questions than journalists can. Third, think critically about what standards you want applied to the use of military force and government power more generally. These aren't abstract policy debates happening in Washington. These are decisions about how your government uses power in your name, and they set precedents that will influence how future administrations operate. The Venezuela situation won't stay contained to the Caribbean forever, and the precedents being set about executive power and military authority will outlast any single administration. What we decide is acceptable now becomes the baseline for what's possible later. So keep watching, keep asking questions, and keep demanding that your representatives provide real oversight of these operations. Democracy doesn't protect itself, and accountability doesn't happen automatically. It requires citizens who care enough to pay attention and officials who are willing to do their jobs even when it's politically difficult. That's how we ensure that government power serves the public interest rather than just the preferences of whoever happens to be in charge. The story of the Venezuelan tanker and the Caribbean boat strikes is still developing, and there will be more revelations in the coming weeks. But what's already clear is that we're watching a significant expansion of executive power justified by the war on drugs and concerns about Venezuelan threats. Whether that expansion is legal, effective, or wise depends partly on facts we don't yet have and partly on judgments about what kind of government power we want to live with. Those are judgments that ultimately belong to the American people, but they can only make them intelligently if they understand what's actually happening. Thank you for staying with me through this analysis. Thank you for caring enough to seek out information beyond the headlines. And thank you for being the kind of citizen who believes that democracy requires an informed public. Keep subscribing, keep sharing this content with people who care about these issues, and keep demanding better from your government. That's how change happens, and that's how accountability works. I'll be back with more analysis as this story develops, and I'll keep bringing you the kind of detailed, thoughtful coverage that these issues deserve.